So as we laid the foundation for absolutism with France, with Richelieu and Louis XIII, and then we went back and we talked about how constitutionalism was established through the Glorious Revolution in England, we're going to go ahead and continue on with the Netherlands. The Dutch are going to pursue constitutionalism, and they're going to be different from France in almost every possible way. We're going to see just the different types of values and how that's played out in their society, in their government. And so, as a reminder, constitutionalism is where the power of the government is really limited by the laws that are set. So, as they form more laws, individuals who are part of um, the government, right, they have to follow them, whereas you're going to see in France that the laws are only dictated by the king. Okay, so there's a real balance that needs to be done between the rights and liberties of individuals, right, in a country, with the power of the government. And constitutionalism is trying to find kind of what is that best balance and mixture between the two. So as we look deeper into what's happening with the Dutch in 1600s, we want to understand not just what's happening in the Netherlands, but outside of it in just what we call Western Europe or modern Europe. So 17th century Europe is where we're going to see the concept of modern Europe is going to be developed from 1650 and onwards. This is really focusing on Western Europe. If we were to take the city of Paris and draw a 500-mile radius around it, countries would be England, the Low Countries, Denmark, the Netherlands, okay, the Spanish um, Netherlands, and you have Switzerland, West Germany, Germany in general, Central Germany, Northern Italy, Scotland. These are what we call Western Europe, and that's what we're going to see develop from this point on as modern Europe. And really, they're going to have an impact on the rest of Europe, America, and the whole world from this point on. They're really going to break away, and so we're going to now, focus a little bit more on Western, and then we're going to come back to Eastern Europe. Okay, it's really after the religious wars, and specifically the Peace of Westphalia, the Treaty of Westphalia, that brought an end to the wars of religion. The Holy Roman Empire to this point has fallen apart, and even the Habsburgs have lost a lot of power. And so we're going to see a lot of these nation states begin to kind of branch out and step forward to be even stronger um, compared to the rest of Europe. Okay, the major players that we will be covering, though, mainly when we talk about Western Europe, are going to be the English, the French, and the Dutch. In England, we know that even though they're gaining strength, they have their own internal political struggles with the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. Okay, we're going to see how that's going to pan out, whether they can survive that. Okay, then you have France. They're going to be the most powerful country, thanks to Richelieu, right, and the wars of religion and taking down the Habsburgs um, and weakening them. But then Louis XIV is going to step in, right, and continue and build off of what Richelieu started. And then we have the Dutch. Okay, so the Dutch, they're a really small population for about, like, I think 1 million people, right? So they're really not as significant. I think like a tenth or even a 15th of France in size. And what made them just powerful and successful is not because of um, how big they are, but essentially their wisdom and their efficiency in using for resources and recognizing what type of land they have, because we call this part of low countries. The sea level is very low and there's always constant flooding. So they use some engineering and they build dikes and dams and they keep the water out or bring water in appropriately, right? To know how to really irrigate and keep, right, land useful. As far as the types of wars that they were involved in, they, as I mentioned, were involved in the 30 Years' War, and it was at this point where, because they were successful, they were able to gain their independence, gain a national identity, and they're no longer under Spanish influence. Okay, just to be distinct as a recap, the northern territories are called the United Provinces, or just the Netherlands, and then you have also Holland, because that's the main province, and then you have the Spanish Netherlands that are in the southern part, and they're not connected. Okay, they're not tied together. The Spanish Netherlands are still loyal to Spain as their territory, um, and for the most part, they are Catholic, right? Whereas in the United Provinces, they are Calvinist, they're Protestant, and they are in the South French speaking. Okay, they're French speaking people. Okay, all right. So this lecture is a little different because if you look at the layout of how the notes are, they're kind of broken off into sections that are by the theme. So just for you to kind of remember that this whole course is built upon these themes that we understand as part of AP Euro, and we're going to be jumping around a little bit, especially on this slide. So you got to recognize like where does the information go, um, which theme does it connect to. So you understand when we look at a country, and we're talking about like a whole century for this country, right? It's really hard to say, well, just a few facts happened, right? We're trying to give you a big overview of everything, and you kind of need to see it all, and not just stages one event at a time, but everything's happening all together. Okay, all right. So a little bit more specific points. Well, we know that we call it the United Provinces. There are 7 provinces, and each province is going to be autonomous. They're going to be self-governing, right? And they each elect what we call a stadtholder. He is basically a governor. Sometimes he's going to be called to be a military leader. And in times of crisis, though, all 7 will elect one to represent, and they'll centralize for a period of time, and they'll go and they'll be able to fight and defend, and go to war with other leaders and countries. And after the crisis is kind of like settled down, then they go back and resume. So in times they recognize they need to work together, and they'll consolidate. And we'll talk about specifically who they will elect. But most of the time, it's going to be from the House of Orange for the single stadtholder. Okay. The Dutch Golden Age took place in the first half of the 17th century, so the early 1600s, and the Dutch were known to be the most wealthy during this time of their Golden Age because, as a republic, they're really flourishing as a civilization, whereas other republics, they had their time, but now the Dutch really have kind of like broken away, and we're going to see like what is it about their country that provides them to do so. So compared to the Italian city-states and even England as a short period as a republic, the Dutch were the most successful in this time, and they had their coined golden age. Okay, as far as the government and how it's established, you have the burghers. They represent Holland, and they are government officials. They are sent from each province. Okay, so they are burghers that go to um, meet together in what we call the Estates General, and they're usually known to be the ones dressed in black, as you saw from the title slide. And the burgher class, they are basically the middle class. They are the merchants, and they are the ones that are wealthy. The nobles in Holland, they're not as successful and growing and thriving as a burgher class. Okay, how the Dutch become more established and significant and growing is that how they used their strength, right? So they had wealth that came from their shipping, and the way that they handled diplomacy was what led them to be successful. It wasn't because they're a dominating empire that's constantly conquering all these lands, okay? But their ways of achieving high levels of art, culture, right, business and commerce, and even intellectually, they had to use the resources, and some of their values of toleration. That is what benefited them. Okay, so I'm going to go over a few things. On the intellectual level, you have 5 universities that are founded in the Netherlands, and Netherlands is going to become an intellectual center in the 1600s. We're going to be seeing many different names come out. You have Spinoza, who's going to come as a philosopher. He's also going to be developing the microscope. Okay, and then you have Leeuwenhoek, he's going to be the father of microbiology. Swammerdam, he's going to be an entomologist, also working on microscopes, um, helping found modern biological science. And you also have Christian Huygens, who is helping invent the telescope. Okay, so with all of these individuals, right, they are contributing to the um, intellectual development of the Netherlands because they took place there. Okay, and also Descartes is also going to be traveling to the Netherlands to continue to learn and practice there. Okay, culturally, you have a lot of different painters. Okay, Frans Hals, Jan Vermeer, Rembrandt. Okay, these names we kind of went over during our Baroque art presentations. And so during this time, right, you have definitely the Baroque style, super Catholic, all about the monarch, right? Um, and they're funded by the royalty and the hierarchical government. However, during the Dutch Golden Age, same pretty much time period, but different approach as how their paintings are. It's going to be more realistic. What happens on an everyday event is trying to really, capture what is the scenery. What are the values and the ideas and how people saw things just in the Netherlands during that time. And the emphasis is really upon the Dutch culture. And so the Golden Age types of painting versus uh, the Baroque is going to be very different, even though, and contrasting, as we mentioned, right, like France and the Netherlands, they have different opposing viewpoints. Okay, all right, and economically, right, we're going to see that there's this phenomenon called tulipomania, where these tulips, just for some reason, began to obtain much value. They were once coming from the Middle East, and because of that, um, they began to surge in price because they were found to be rare and beautiful. And over time, people began to investing in them, and they began to plant them there. And so it was a phenomenon where you had the highest price was worth 10 times just for one bulb, right? One tulip bulb, just one single bulb, right? Was worth 10 times the annual income of one craftsman, right? So imagine, like a craftsman, works, probably like a blue collar job. So maybe works like around $35,000 a year, right? Not too great in America right now, right? But if you were to multiply that by 10, $350,000 by just for one bulb, right? That's insane of how that would skyrocket. Many of the merchant class would invest in this and saying, hey, it's a great way, because they would really speculate as to why, they can make more money. Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? Right? And there's kind of this whole market and investment that's happening. Um, Significance is really, this is kind of the first example of how many investors are over speculating, and then we're going to see there's going to be a crash, and from that point on, the tulip is nothing more than just a flower to the Netherlands, and most of them are still grown there today. Okay, all right, and last thing that they're known for is that they have a toleration for other religions. Now they're predominantly Calvinist, but there are some Armenian factions. Remember, Armenians do not believe in predestination. They believe more in just free will. And so Calvinists obviously believe in predestination. So there's kind of a little split there, but they tolerate them. Catholics and Jews also would flee to the Netherlands because they have that religious freedom. They're not completely equal, but they have a little bit fewer rights, but they have freedom of worship for sure. And so because they had religious toleration, it kind of brought this cosmopolitan society. It promoted trade. A lot of these Catholics and Jews were very successful merchants and investors in their home countries, and by coming there, they brought their skills and their knowledge and their wealth with them. Okay, all right. So this is a graph of the tulip price index. So even in about like 6 months, you can kind of see how the price of something just really just blew up and rose, and finally it just came to a crash. Um, and it was just a period of time where, as an example, that is significant for Western society to look at as like, oh, that was one of the first examples of a crash. and even just the origin of mass-produced tulips. Okay, all right. So the E represents a lot of the economic points that I'll be making. And this is pretty much where it's all coming from. Okay, so the Netherlands is going to become the greatest mercantile nation in the 1600s. Like I said before, they don't have a whole lot of natural resources, but because they're heavy on commerce and they really knew how trade worked and how to make profit off of that, they were very successful. Fishing is going to be kind of their main industry, but there's other major industries: textiles, furniture, okay, wood making, all that kind of stuff. Don't really need to get into that. The main thing is that they were traders. Okay, so by 1600, we're going to see the Dutch are going to have 10,000 ships. Okay, and what would they do to the ships? They are basically masters of trading, of transporting goods to and from other nations, and so they owned most of the shipping lines, those routes, and so they would ship between Spain and France and England and across the Baltic and even across to the Americas. Um, Other developments are that improved their economy was that they found their own East India Company. So you have the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company. And in the East, they basically took over the Spice Islands, which is Batavia. So originally the Portuguese were there, but the Dutch are now going to be taking over the island of Java. So Batavia stands for Holland, just in Latin. And so if you know where Indonesia is, Jakarta, that's where they're able to take over the Spice Islands. Successful there. In For the western area, they're able to engage with Latin America, with Africa. Also, they were able to find Manhattan Island, which is NYC today. Okay. Um, then they're able to also take from the Portuguese the Cape of Good Hope, which is the portion in South Africa, right? And so you have a bunch of Dutch and French Huguenots that are moving down to South Africa, and then later they're going to be established as the Afrikaners. They are going to settle in South Africa. Okay, so we're seeing them right even leave their country, and that's going to improve their economy by bringing in right the natural resources that they don't normally have in their own country. And finally, we're going to see that they're going to be a financial capital. Okay, I think the date is wrong. I think it's 1609, but regardless, it's not that big of a deal. The Bank of Amsterdam, okay, is the center point of what really hits their climax of the apex of their economic success, right? So through the Bank of Amsterdam, we're going to see international currency is going to be established, and that's where the exchanges are going to be made. Checks are going to be written, loans are going to be given out, and if you guys remember, with loans, there's interest, and because they had the lowest interest rates at this point, they really was able to attract more business, and more people would take out loans from them rather than from other places like England. And so Amsterdam's now going to replace Antwerp. We talked about how Antwerp was before one of the major financial capitals, right? But now we're going to see that because the Netherlands has strong banking and commercial system, right? They're going to be the number one financial capital up until the French Revolution, 1789. So for about, let's say, 180 years, okay, they're going to hold on to that position, right? So now they have a lucrative colonial empire, right? They have a huge fleet of ships. They're a financial capital of the world. They have, a great impact upon their country, but this would also bring a lot of conflict with other nations because they're competitive. And so one example is going to be with the English in 1651. They're going to establish their own navigation acts again, and England's going to try to pursue to build their own colonial empire, and they're aiming to take down the Dutch. So once we're supporting each other through the wars of religion, also, right, they kind of like switch upon each other because they're competitive in order to build their economies. And so the English have said, according to the Navigation Acts, all imported goods had to be brought in on English ships. You cannot bring anything into England unless it's from English ships. We don't want any Dutch ships here as a threat. Okay, so overall, their economy is booming, right? So the Dutch are doing well, but because of wars that are happening because of navigation acts from the 1650s to the early 1670s, these 20 years, money is going to be funneled in to fight England, but also from the 1670s in that time, they're going to begin fighting with France because Louis XIV, right, is rivals with our next guy, William of Orange, and even though the Dutch, the Netherlands, was able to survive through these wars, right, and we're going to see Louis XIV go through many wars. Um, they're going to become weaker because of all the money that is channeled and funneled into these wars. Okay, all right. So just to end, William of Orange, he's going to be one of our main characters. A few characteristics about him is that he's very educated and reserved. He's a Calvinist, and he just had a very plain life. Yeah, he would always, his dad, right, and his grandfather, they would always be called to be that central stadtholder, right? All 7 provinces would elect him, but he was never the one to seek it out for fame for that purpose, right? He merely just wanted to represent his country, and he was elected, so he had no choice. And he really is the enemy of Louis XIV because of just their upbringing, right, and their values and how they see their positions of leadership. Okay, he's going to be William III, if you remember from the Glorious Revolution. He becomes King of England, and he chooses to be so because of his rivalry with France, not so much because he wants to marry his cousin, which he did, right, as you see from this family tree. So as the enemy of Louis XIV, essentially, we're going to see from this point when Louis XIV begins to get a little too ambitious, right? He's going to start attacking the Dutch, and we're going to see many wars break out because of this.